Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Spencertown Academy Art Center's second Community Reads event. My name is Jill Kalotay, and I'm a board member of the Spencertown Academy Art Center, an essentially all-volunteer organization presenting arts events of all kinds in our landmark 1847 building in Spencertown, New York. Community Reads is an extension of our annual Festival of Books, which is totally online this year. Most of our scheduled events are completed now, but our online special book sale is going on still, with some new arrivals just this past weekend. And our Community Rights Project is accepting entries until this Friday. Your essays, short stories, and memoirs are all welcome for judging by our panel of readers. Check it all out at spencertownacademy.org. Community Reads is a part of our effort to keep us engaged with books and to provide a gathering place to discuss what we are reading, hopefully providing diversion and common activity, and in the case of tonight's book, a really good mental workout. If you have questions or comments for our panelists, please send them in at any time during the discussion. Just click on the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to them a little later in the session. Also, this is the internet and glitches happen. If we do have a technical issue, please be patient and we'll try to fix it as quickly as possible. Tonight, we are honored to have with us the distinguished historian and author Jill Lepore and her co-discussant and fellow historian, Sheila Curran Bernard. We will be focusing on Jill's 2019 publication, This America, The Case for the Nation, based on her essays in foreign affairs and the New Yorker. In the acknowledgements in this book, she thanks readers of her previous book, These Truths, A History of the United States, who asked hard questions that she felt compelled to address. You know, they say you can't judge a book by its cover. Well, this is a cute little book, but it packs a wallop of ideas. It explores the concepts of a nation, the history of nationalism and its various meanings and iterations in America, and takes a close look at our continuing bitter struggles over immigration. Before we get into it all, let me introduce our guests. Jill Lepore is the David Woods Kemper 41 Professor of American History at Harvard University. She is also a staff writer at the New Yorker and the host of the podcast, The Lost Archive. She is the author of many award-winning books. Jill is a recipient of many honors, awards, and honorary degrees, and has been a finalist for the National Book Award, the National Magazine Award, and twice for the Pulitzer Prize. She has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and to the American Philosophical Society. Her newest book is If, Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future, just out this month and already longlisted for a National Book Award. Welcome, Jill.
Thanks so much, Jill.
Thank you. Sheila Curran Bernard is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University at Albany, SUNY, and director of the Institute for History and Public Engagement. She is an Emmy and Peabody Award-winning filmmaker, whose credits include the civil rights series Eyes on the Prize and the feature documentary Slavery by Another Name, based on the book by Douglas A. Blackmun. She is also the author of Documentary Storytelling, Creative Nonfiction on Screen, now going into its 5th edition, and with Ken Rabin, Archival Storytelling, which has a 2nd edition just out in May 2020, both with Local Press. Welcome, Sheila. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to thank you, Jill Kalotay, for setting this up, and the Spencertown Academy for hosting this. So I can't think of a better time to talk about this book, This America, The Case for the Nation, just 6 weeks before the presidential election. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend that you read it. You can also get it in an audiobook read by Jill herself. It's really thought-provoking, and it's really a book, a historic book for our times. So I'm going to get into a few questions, and then very quickly we're going to open it up to you all. There's about 60 people so far on the line, which is great. So you just type your questions, as they said, into the Q&A thing. So one of the things that struck me about the book was how recent the idea of nation was in terms of, you know, global history. That it had only come about in France around the time of the Revolution and shortly after, as our Constitution was getting formed. But it really didn't become something that was an issue until the early 1830s. And then once we have nation, our history has to be written. And so you talked about George Bancroft's volume, this 10-volume history published between 1834 and 1874. And I wonder if you could talk about that and the importance of him choosing to start the history of the United States in 1492. The significance of that.
Sure. First, thanks so much to the Spencertown Academy for hosting the event, and especially thanks to you, Sheila, for doing this. It's really super fun to be in conversation with you. Yeah, so, you know, a nation every nation is an invention, and one of the ways in which a nation invents itself is by telling a story about its past. The modern nation state, no less than kind of the nations of antiquity. In the United States, people who wanted to offer up the new nation state a history were in something of a bind, because the United States is a very definitive moment in time, is born, you know, in July of 1776, when it declares its independence and its sovereignty. And that first generation of Americans were really interested in thinking about all things American. They wanted no longer to be using English textbooks in their schools. You know, it's the same spirit of nationalism that leads Noah Webster to decide that Americans should spell words differently than they're spelled in England. This is why we have C-O-L-O-R instead of C-O-L-O-U-R, just so that you could know when you read someone's writing, whether they were English or American, that there needed to be these marks of distinction. So one of the first substantial attempts to chronicle the history of the country for this purpose, for the sake of creating a kind of sense of nationalism and national attachment, was George Bancroft's multi-volume history. But Bancroft was, you know, writing a mere 50 years after the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. That's a very short book. And it also, as far as Bancroft saw it, it cut out the providential account of the nation as having been kind of founded by God, right? That he had a providentialist worldview as a historian. So he decided to begin the history of the United States in 1492 with Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic, and as a way to incorporate, to just kind of borrow all of that history of the so-called Age of Discovery and import it into an American narrative of kind of the inevitable founding of what in Bancroft's day was becoming increasingly to be seen as possibly a continental nation.
So, but what's interesting also is it becomes a history of white people in America, because it becomes a history of, it starts when white people land here. And it kind of, but it's also interesting because in some ways that has become the narrative that was in textbooks even throughout the 20th century. And I was thinking no, go ahead.
I was going to say, although there was something of a contest about that in the 19th century. So there was a bit of a battle between New Englanders who, when they wanted to think about the colonial history of the United States, they always wanted to begin in 1620 with the Mayflower and the Mayflower Compact and the founding of Plymouth Colony. And Virginians wanted the story to begin in 1606 with Jamestown. But a lot of New Englanders who are abolitionists said, no, the real date is 1619, right? So we think of that as like this New York Times, this was the New York Times project date, and kind of came from them. But in fact, that was an argument that abolitionists made in the 19th century, that the story of America is always bound together. The stories of liberty and slavery are always bound together. And that you have to think about that year and the turning point of 1619 into 1620 as the fulcrum on which, you know, the the paradox of America is born, the land of liberty that is also the last bastion of chattel slavery in the modern world.
Well, so can you, in the context of that, I guess it made me think about Trump's last week deciding that we need what he called a pro-American curriculum that celebrates the truth about our nation's history, and even he called it the miracle of American history. So he's not thinking, I mean, he's directly opposing the 1619 project. So what does that say about where we are now? So, I mean, we're now at the 250th anniversary of the founding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that speech of Trump's got quite a bit more attention than it really warranted. It's just a, election season political ploy. It's just kind of a red meat, tossed to the hungry, certain of his followers. Trump is not a serious critic of the study of American history in any form. He's not a student of what goes on in K2 through 12 classrooms or at universities. I don't think his speech writers are either. It was really just kind of, let's see what kind of press coverage we can get. How can we turn the news how can we get a particular kind of attention in this news cycle? It's like a meaningless stunt. So I don't think it tells us a whole lot, in short, about our time. That said, one of the reasons that I wrote the book before that I wrote before This America, These Truths, A History of the United States, was in an attempt to recognize that we have become so polarized that we have two competing and utterly incommensurate versions of the nation's past in our popular culture. We have a kind of miracle of America. Maybe that goes too far, because that's a particularly providential evangelical view. But we have a kind of, Newt Gingrich, who himself has a PhD in history, would often offer up an account of the history of the United States that was, a march of triumphs. And then you have on the left, Howard Zinn's People's History, which is really a story of repeated atrocities and failures. Neither of those accounts can stand the scrutiny of historical evidence and analysis. And it just serves the public that there are these really these accounts that just map onto polarized political positions. So, as you know very well, history is a discipline. It's a discipline within the world of the humanities. There are methods, there are standards of evidence, there are rules of evidence, there are lines of argument to engage with. It's not just a toy that you can play with to make a political argument. I mean, it can be used that way, but that's not what we do. That's a completely different way of thinking about the relationship between the past and the present.
Well, it's funny, a colleague of mine was in engineering before he moved over to history, and one of his engineering professors actually said to him, well, I don't understand, all the dates and stuff are known. So what's there for a historian to do? Yeah,
well, it's like saying to a chemist, well, the periodic table has been figured out. What's left?
You're done. You're done. So let's skip ahead a little bit to look. You write of liberalism, that liberalism is the belief that people are good and should be free, and that people erect governments in order to guarantee that freedom. So that the original impulse of liberalism was towards nationalism, that people set up governments that are self-governed, right? And then you talk about illiberal nationalism versus liberal nationalism. Can you explain the difference between those two?
Yeah, I can attempt to. It's hard to be cogent about something that you've written a whole book about in such brief terms, but I think we do sort of lose sight of what a liberal nation state is, right? It is the only form of organization of a society that can guarantee rights to its members, and exists in order to guarantee rights to its members. So we don't have some other way to organize. Like the nation state hasn't always existed. It's a historical artifact of a moment in time. The nation state won't necessarily always exist. We also no longer live in city states, and we're no longer a wholly agrarian people. And there's lots of things that have come and gone. But while we live in the nation state, it's essential to human flourishing, because it's the institution that at the moment is guaranteeing human rights or doing its best to offer up that guarantee. Illiberal nationalism, so to celebrate that is what liberal nationalism is. And then therefore there's a paradox, right? Because liberal nationalism will always be essentially kind of universalism. There's nothing particular about any any liberal nation state that offers those things up. It's the idea of being able to offer those things up. So there's a universalism there. Illiberal nationalism is, is the celebration of a particular nation as above all others, whose interests are, whose leaders can conscript the resources and the lives of the members of the nation state to advance these national aims that the leader might have. The fomenting of illiberal nationalism is generally used by autocrats in order to gain followers to execute illiberal ends. Most often, historically, wars of aggression. Like if you're going to try to convince people to fight a war of aggression on behalf of their country, there has to be a reason for it. There's a whole ideological apparatus behind that props up, this is a better nation than any other nations. All other nations, we have grievances with all of them. They have harmed us even though we're better. There's a whole world of rhetorical moves that lie behind that kind of a liberalism, which just generally, just by definition has ends that involve demanding sacrifice rather than guaranteeing rights.
So then you get the nationalism that is not about loving the country, but hating everybody else's country and people and cultures, etc. But somehow it all gets wrapped up into this patriotic flag, and they've kind of, like in this country, you think of the Trump rallies and these parades of pickup trucks with flags coming out of the back. Mm-hmm. How do the liberals lose control of the patriotism label, and how can they get it back?
Yeah. It's not so much that they lost control. I think in many instances they rejected it, right? So there was a great shrinking against any kind of embrace of nationalism after the Second World War on the part of all kinds of liberals, and including intellectuals, but all kinds of liberals who looked, as the world did, with horror and shock and revulsion at the atrocities of what was done in the name of Germany and Italy and Japan, and came to the conclusion that all nationalism eventually becomes illiberal. And therefore, it was essential to think of ways to distance oneself from nationalist claims. And because nationalism and patriotism can very often be quite close to one another, and are often mistaken for one another. It's always in the interests of an illiberal nationalist to cloak himself in patriotism. It came to be the case that liberals just didn't talk in patriotic terms. They just thought it was a slippery slope into something much more dangerous. At the same time, in the academy, American historians stopped writing national histories because national histories can be so easily conscripted for the sake of illiberal nationalist aims. And you can understand the sequence of events wherein that all happened. But as many a shrewd commentator has pointed out, in the history of the United States, very few social movements have ever achieved significant change without at least cloaking their objectives in the idea of America and subscribing to that idea, from Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King to leaders of women's movements, there's not a political movement that you can think of that there isn't a turn when it becomes essential not to reject the idea of America, but to present one's own political ambitions as the next step in realizing the promise of the idea of America.
There's a couple questions coming in, so I'll just ask a couple more. In your book, you argue for the enduring importance of the United States of American civic ideals by arguing against nationalism and for liberalism. And I'm wondering if you can discuss a little bit more what you mean by that. And also, how do you have that argument when the illiberal part of it, they're not debating with facts and evidence at hand. They're not playing by the rules. So how do you have how do you maintain civic conversation, civic engagement, a level of discussion when you're not even sort of playing the same game? How do you do that?
Yeah. I actually think that new forms of political community or rekindling old forms of political community in American communities has to begin with reflection on one's own contributions to the state of the problem, not with reflections on other people's failings. So, you know, I spent a lot of time in 2009 with people from the Tea Party movement, you know, that began right after Barack Obama's inauguration in January of 2009. You know, that began actually as opposition to the bailout that, you know, had begun during the Bush administration, but took sharp focus as the Obama bailout magnified that, and then directed a special ire at the proposal for the Affordable Health Care Plan, or the Affordable Health Care Act. And I just was reporting on the Tea Party movement by going to meetings of the Boston Tea Party, partly because I just thought that was so cool that there was a Boston chapter of the Tea Party. At the same time, though, I was teaching a seminar on the American Revolution at Harvard, where I teach. And so it was a very surreal experience of teaching, you know, all afternoon, then getting on my bike and going to Boston and hanging out in the Green Dragon Tavern where they had their meetings, which is where the Sons of Liberty met, with these, you know, lovely people who were very avowedly patriotic and really fascinated by the American Revolution. One of the things that had drawn them into the Tea Party movement was the kind of 18th century stuff of it, the reenactment-y stuff. People wore tri-cornered hats to these meetings in the tavern. There was a kind of jokey kind of cosplay thing of it. And I really disagreed with them politically, but I spent a lot of time hearing them out. And one of the things that was so interesting to me was how, from the vantage of a scholar of the 18th century, how kooky their understanding of the revolution was. Just completely out of step with what scholarship of the last half century has revealed and chronicled. And, you know, at some level, unsurprisingly, but the revolution really was to them this kind of comic book, like the Justice League. There's like, you know, where George Washington is Superman, and Thomas Paine is Aquaman, and Benjamin Franklin, like it. And I'm not ridiculing them. Like, I actually, like, most things that I only ever studied in elementary school have that kind of quality in my head. Like, I just don't really, I don't have a lot of dimensionality to my understanding, say, of chemistry. I never studied it in college. I didn't like it in high school. Like, it's kind of like, I can picture the periodic table on the wall, and that's kind of that. Like, I know that chemistry is much more than that, but I can't see it that way. And how I came to think about that was, this was my fault. It was the fault of my discipline. It wasn't the fault, like, what have we been doing within the walls of the academy for the last half century that this goofy caricature of a historical account that, you know, that George Bancroft could have written, you know, like, why have we allowed our scholarship to be marooned in the academy and not work its way out into the curriculum that people would encounter in, say, high school?
Well, this actually leads to one of the questions that you got, which is writing about historians. I think you specifically were talking about abandoning writing about the nation because it leaves it open for demagogues to create their own history of the nation. But there's also a sense of, you know, what you just said, that historians are abandoning trying to communicate to the public, and it leaves a vacuum for others, like Bill O'Reilly, to fill with their history. And this questioner was asking if you could speak to this about the vacuum, and I guess what historians should be doing about this.
Yeah, well, so while I was working on that Tea Party project, I was writing an article for the New Yorker that later became a book called The Whites of Their Eyes, which, you know, obviously has a double meaning. Glenn Beck had just started his show on Fox News. I think it started the week before Obama's inauguration. And he at one point turned his studio into a mock classroom. Like, he had oak desks and a chalkboard, and he would give these little history lessons. And Sean Hannity did the same thing. He had this Liberty Tree icon, and he was forever talking about, you know, Sam Adams and the greatness of Sam Adams, or what, he just regaling like tales from, and all of it was, you know, to rile up the Tea Party, which was the, the political product that was being sold as a commodity on this news network as commentary. But people loved it because people are actually really interested in history. Like, and well, what are we doing? I don't want to run, Glenn Beck. I don't want to run a show like Glenn Beck. Like that's not the answer. But what we've been doing is clearly not enough. And, I've said this in public before, and people get up and they object to it on these grounds. They say, you know what, people that teach biology and chemistry and earth sciences have been doing a really good job, and those things are still studied and taught, and yet no one believes in climate, like this is huge climate change denialism. Do you blame the scientists for that? And I think that's a good point. But I guess I'm trying to sort of emphasize the principle of, instead of saying, because your question was, what do you do when other people don't believe in facts? I try to begin not with like, what do I do with when other people have failed me and not understanding my worldview? I try to begin with, what have I done? Where have I failed in not understanding other people's worldview? So for that Tea Party book, when it came out, I don't usually go on book tours, but I went around the country and I went to a lot of events, and I went to a lot of events in red states and had really interesting conversations with people. And I got some sense of where the gap lay, like what was the gap between us. And it's a big part of how I came to write these truths, because I just thought, oh, well, here's what I'm not going to have a TV show. I don't want to do that. Here's what I can do. And I wrote these truths. Or then I thought, oh, maybe I should try to reach young people. So I'm doing a textbook edition. We might do a kids book edition. I'm doing this podcast. Like, these are things I can do. Other people can do different things. You can make films. But I don't mean to diminish, like, I actually think doing the work of teaching, showing up and teaching all day is the main thing. But maybe teaching all day with a little bit more sensitivity to the political diversity of our students who come from really different vantages. Maybe with a little bit more sensitivity to the civics work that you do in any American history classroom, of asking people to think hard about the nature of our democratic institutions and our constitutional system. That has really been taken out of the curriculum, especially at elite universities and colleges. So I do think there's a lot that any given historian can do. And then there are things that involve, like, what is the kind of work you could be good at? Where do your talents lie? What's a place where you could maybe make a difference? Maybe it's visiting high schools. Maybe it's helping a community paint a new mural, design and paint a new mural. Like, there's 1,000 ways to do that kind of thing.
Excellent. All right. Another question is, it's a little bit of a different direction. Is it possible to write, think, establish a definitive narrative of the American nation, the United States, without taking in consideration the influence of the American government in Latin American countries since the 19th century, but especially in the 20th century? American liberalism inspired national narratives in Brazil and Chile, while these countries were under dictatorship governments in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah, I mean, you can infinitely say, here are more things that need to be in any definitive account of this truth. Like the list will always be endless. Is it possible to write such an account without that? That's up to the historian, right? It can be done. There is no final account of American history. Anytime anybody attempts to write something, they're just putting forth, like, here's my best effort. I didn't write these truths to become, the new authoritative history of the United States for all time. I wrote it to rekindle the tradition of a scholar at a certain point in her career attempting to offer to the public a sweeping synthetic account that is a stamp of a moment in time that makes a good faith effort to compile the best and most provocative scholarship, the best and most vivid evidence to bear. So, there's not, in these truths, there's not a whole lot about U.S. interference in Latin America during the Cold War. It's, of course, a crucially important piece of the story of the Cold War. There's actually a fair amount of it in my new book, If Then, which is just out, which has this whole crazy thing that this early pioneering data science company does for the US government trying to conduct a simulation of the Venezuelan economy in 1963 and 1964. It recounts the story of Project Camelot, which is a quite similar project that is eventually terminated by the Johnson administration after the Chilean legislature opposes it. I mean, there's a wealth of really important stories, many of which are still not been told about that. But it is, when one writes a history of a nation, one's not writing an encyclopedia.
Right. Well, and it's because there's something in your book, I don't have it in front of me, where you talk about even the founding documents that people understood when they were creating this nation, that it was an experiment, and they were expecting that the citizenry was going to be going back to these documents and investigating it, which also is about the nature of evidence too, right? Just to get to the evidence thing, in terms of when you as a historian look at evidence, it's not necessarily that the answers are obvious, that you would look at the evidence differently than another historian might look at the evidence. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that, the process of doing history?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm an empiricist. Like, there are rules. I teach a course at the Harvard Law School on the history of evidence. I think a lot about the rules of evidence across realms of knowledge and bodies of work and different scholarly disciplines. The rules of historical evidence derive from the rules in a criminal court. Historically, they are the descendant of those rules. They're all close analogs. I mean, there's some things that are distinctive to history, but in a probate, you can't introduce a copy of a will. You have to have the original. We have a rule like that in historical research. You actually have to get to the original document. I mean, if you have a copy, there are all kinds of provenance questions that you have to ask about its authenticity. As in a criminal court case, you ideally don't want purely circumstantial evidence. You want something, you want an eyewitness, or you want a confession. There are hierarchies of types of evidence. We have very similar rules in historical investigation. We have rules about the admission of hearsay or the admission of testimony from a hostile witness. All of those rules of evidence that that obtain in a courtroom obtain in one fashion or another in the work of history. A lot of the rules of evidence in history are quite similar to those of journalism. Before recent times, it was completely unacceptable to use an anonymous source, except under very narrow set of circumstances, as a respectable journalist. Historians can't offer up stuff that they can't footnote. It can't be like, well, I know this because someone whose name I cannot tell you who it was told it to me. You can't say that in historical research. So, but nevertheless, as in a court case, you can have lawyers that have the same body of evidence before them. By definition, they have the same body of evidence before them, and they're arguing completely different points of view. And that's what our jury system is for. And in the equivalent in historical research is peer review, or the process of revision. Someone can look at your work and look at the evidence that you use and come to completely disagree with you and argue. Offer up a completely different interpretation of the same body of evidence. That's not a flaw with history as a discipline. That's the method.
Sure. Excellent. Okay, I have a question. Somebody said they love the book, This America That's Penetrating and Lucid Scholarship, but they were surprised at your dismissal of Howard Zinn. And the question was, aren't the atrocities he wrote about real and undervalued, with many people ignorant of them or denying them?
Mm-hmm. So Howard Zinn and I overlapped for a time at Boston University when I was one of my first jobs out of graduate school. I taught there, and I never met him, although we were on a radio show together once. I think Zinn was an incredible man of great courage. I think he was a gentle man of tremendously deep and firm convictions. I really admire much of what he did in his life. And I know that readers of a people's history are passionately loyal to it. So I'm not surprised. It pisses people off when I say, I think Zinn's People's History is a terrible book. I think it is a terrible book. He was not a historian. He was a political scientist. He wrote the book. I read a little bit of it in The Whites of Their Eyes. He wrote the book essentially as part of the People's Commission on the Bicentennial, or as a kind of offshoot of that. The effort to commemorate the bicentennial of the United States, which was going to reach its crescendo in 1776, began during Lyndon Johnson's administration, and Johnson had appointed a bicentennial commission, a presidential bicentennial commission. It was really interesting. This is about 64 or 65. Really wanted to sort of fold the story of the civil rights struggle into the story of the revolution and fuse them to be the nation's story. The nation's story is these struggles for freedom. Nixon, when the thing was fairly chaotic and didn't work especially well, and when Nixon was elected, he basically fired everybody from Johnson's commission and appointed what would be somewhat similar to what Trump's patriotic education would look like, right? Like Nixon he didn't want to tell the kind of a Black Lives Matter story as part of the American story, that those people could do their own thing. And so the movement to commemorate the bicentennial splintered. There were, the story I tell in the book is in 1973 in Boston, on the anniversary of the dumping of the tea, the so-called Boston Tea Party, there were like 9 different protests of the official celebration, which was this completely whitewashed thing. There was an indigenous peoples organization, that protested. There was a veterans organization that protested because they were protesting Vietnam. There was actually a gay pride movement that was protesting and marched through the bicentennial. Zinn was very much like of that Boston moment, like fighting against Nixon's version of American history. And I think very much in the passion of that moment, like many other Marxist historians, wanted to lift up the stories of all these other people. And I see why that was a really important piece of work at the time. I think it was galvanizing for people in the counterculture, for people in the New Left. The book was written in 1975. There aren't a lot of histories of the United States written or any books about the United States written in 1975 that we are still reading, because history is a fairly fast-moving discipline. Sure. So even if I didn't think it was kind of a lousy book, it's also really wildly outdated and doesn't include, the real revolution in the writing of American history has been in the 50 years since then, when women and people of color entered the academy and excavated an incredible amount from the archives and have been telling stories of really rich sophistication that Zinn could not possibly have known about.
Right. It'll be interesting to see. I know planning is already well underway for the 250th to 2026. It'll be interesting to see what that looks like compared to others. There's a question: if Biden wins in November, what does history tell us about the power of a different voice, a different ethos in the White House, and its ability to reunify the country?
We are in uncharted ground here, man. There's nothing history can tell us right now. We have to reinvent the whole thing from the ground up.
Well, that sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah.
Well, actually, this question leads up on that then. This America is hugely provocative. Thanks for joining us tonight. As we struggle with the rise of nationalism today and think about ways to counter it, are there lessons in our history that could help us today?
Yeah, I think the pattern that you see described in the book, I think I say, I'll just confess, it's a really long time since I looked at this book. I think I say in the book that, that there are always two nationalisms in the United States, and there have been really almost from the very start, competing with one another. Two visions of the nation, two kinds of nationalism. And it's a kind of ongoing battle between the two. So we're in a period where illiberal nationalism is triumphant. It is also continually ascending. It's not like reached a pinnacle and on its way down. But what has defeated it, as I think I try to point out in the book time and time again, is when liberals are willing to say that they care about the country. When liberals spend all their time battling other liberals and saying that the country is really bad and their political opponents are stupid, then they just keep failing. So I do think, they're not profound lessons. They're things you can notice just by reading your newspaper, but they are kind of persistent patterns.
But along the Biden lines, like there was a quote you had from the Atlanta Constitution, when columnist Ralph McGill was writing about a synagogue bombing in 1958, and he said, to be sure, none said go bomb a Jewish temple or school, but let it be understood that when leadership in high places in any degree fails to support constituted authority, it opens the gate to all those who wish to take the law into their hands, which of course resonates today. And I guess the question is, can there be a nation without a nation's leader? And maybe how Trump has not been a leader for the entire nation. He's been a leader for some of the nation. Does the leadership make that much difference? Or is there another way to have a nation that's maybe even more democratic and doesn't require the necessity of somebody who's going to say, no, this is the law, and everybody is going to abide by it?
I think the office of the president, the office of the executive has grown wildly inflated. I don't think a lot of people would disagree with that, relative to the very fragile balance of powers between the three branches of government. That is the aim of the Constitution. It's a mess, right? Like, I think there's not a lot of disagreement that, and you can easily say, well, Democratic presidents have expanded the powers of the presidency to include, including Obama, and that's absolutely the case. Like, I'm not saying, Trump came in and somehow completely transformed the office of the president. A lot of transformation preceded him, and there too, I would say, I think there have been some pretty big contributors to that, and among them has been the kind of fetish for presidential biography. The treatment of the president as a celebrity is a huge problem for the office. So just like that sense of intimacy and scale, it's a huge problem for our constitutional order. That said, it has in many points in the nation's past been really important for the president to exert a kind of leadership that only one person can exert, which is the person who has that role, as the moral leader of the nation, as a kind of teacher and a guide. And obviously that's not the role as Donald Trump understands it. And I do think that is the role as Joe Biden understands it. The question will be, whether the technologies of communication that are available to Biden, were he to be elected, would make it possible for him to inhabit that role and execute that role in the way that he would like to, or whether it will simply be impossible. Trump has made Twitter his mouthpiece, but it has also limited the reach of his presidency. I mean, I have to say, I've never looked once at President Trump's Twitter account. It's sent to me all the time because the newspaper quotes it all the time, but I'm not on Twitter. The vast overwhelming majority of Americans are not on Twitter. There's a certain finite number of people that follow President Trump on Twitter, and they have been fairly constant. And then reporters have to follow him who are covering the presidency. In other words, like Joe Biden couldn't come in and be on Twitter and somehow have a national platform on which to speak. It's simply not that. And doing what, FDR, when FDR broadcast his fireside addresses, they were on every station on the radio. So you couldn't not listen to them. People told stories about walking down the street in a city and you wouldn't miss a word of an FDR speech, because just as cars driving by or department stores that had loudspeakers out underneath their awnings, you were just constantly in the speech, no matter where you went. It was ubiquitous, or think about, when someone like Reagan addressed the nation, and the address is going to be broadcast on all three networks on prime time, and most people are sitting around watching TV. It's 8 p.m. There is no national platform left with which to undertake that work as the national leader. So, I mean, it's hard to imagine how that could take place. On the other hand, there are people who are doing the work whose job has got to be, one has to think, imagining that right now.
Sure. Do you mind answering a question about the podcast? It's so
No, that's fine.
It's so specific. Can you talk a little more about Clem Whitaker and Gleona Baxter at Campaigns Inc., the quote, factory lie? Do you think they helped to establish the foundations of the so-called low trust society we live in America? I missed an episode about them in this season of The Last Archive.
Oh yeah, I didn't do an episode about them actually. I write about them quite a bit in These Truths. So Clem Whitaker, for people who don't know what this question is about, Clem Whitaker and Leon Baxter were a married couple, or they married after they began working together, who ran a company called Campaigns Inc. that was the first political consulting firm anywhere in the world. It was founded in the 1930s in California. And incredible powerhouses, and also like incredibly appealing characters to write about, because they're not bad people, but they're doing some pretty sketchy things. I wrote an article about them for the New Yorker many years ago called The Lie Factory, because Upton Sinclair called them the Lie Factory. Yeah, I think they're pretty pivotal in making it clear that political campaigns could be conducted with the tools of mass advertising. Mass advertising was a new thing in the 1920s, the kind of Edward Bernays way. These guys had come from that world, and they decided, oh, well, they could sell a service to political candidates or to lobbyists who were trying to oppose, in California had a lot of referendums even then, who were trying to oppose ballot initiatives by running advertising campaigns against candidates and on issues. They are responsible for the fact that we did not get national health care in the 1950s after Truman proposed it as the last unfinished work of the New Deal. They pretty much single-handedly defeated that, even though most Americans wanted it. Incredible wizards of political communication. Their work is a little bit of why I ended up writing this book that's out just now about the first data science company to do political work, that the Simulmatics Corporation that did research for Kennedy's campaign in 1960. I'm fascinated by the ethical rationales that people give themselves when they're revolutionizing political communication in ways that many people understand at the time are dangerous. They're incredible critics of what Whitaker and Baxter were doing, who wrote with great cogency and force about how what they were doing was going to undermine democracy. And they did it anyway. And the same thing happened with Simulmatics Corporation. They did it anyway. The idea that somehow like we should wait for Facebook to figure out how to stop ruining our democracy. Look, they're going to do it anyway. They're making a lot of money by ruining our democracy.
Someone asked, they said we've been through turbulent decades in the history, the 1790s, 1850s, 1860s, 1930s, 1960s. Do you feel this is worse? Are we in the worst period now? Is there anything we can...
I don't mean to just keep pointing to my own work, but I wrote a long essay this winter called The Last Time Democracy Nearly Died. That's an extended comparison of the 1930s and the present.
Oh, good. Look that up, you guys. What's the title?
So yeah, it's called, I don't know what the online, I think it's called The Last Time Democracy Nearly Died. Although I think the magazine title was In Every Dark Hour, which comes from a FDR speech. I'm teaching this semester, and the very first debate that my students had to have was this question. I asked them, they had to debate the resolution. The American democracy is in no more crisis today than it was in either the 1960s or the 1930s. So to your questioner, it's such a good question that I assigned it to my students.
But did you give them an answer?
No, that was for them to debate, yeah.
What countries do you most admire and why?
I really admire the United States. I at the moment, I can't see a country in a like snapshot way. Like I think about its whole history. So most countries have such terrifying history. most nation states have such terrifying histories that I kind of can't endorse the idea of a country. You know, and there's also that, was it Simone Weil who writes about, she had converted to Catholicism, and she writes about how if you're drawn to be in a religion, you probably should stick with the religion you were raised with. You'd have to have a lot of good reasons to switch to a new religion if what you want is religion. I always think about that because I was raised a Catholic and I've experimented with many other religions, but I'm still really a Catholic. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm reflecting in very vague ways on the question, but I don't have a like top 10 favorite nations list.
Well, getting back to the future of nations, the fact that they are such a recent invention, and looking at what's happening with like the European Union, with Brexit, and looking at the division in this country in terms of the states, and people talking about secession in certain states and things. And then with the issues you raise in the book, like, you know, climate change is a global issue. The migration of people as a direct result of climate change is going to just continue to get worse and worse and worse. And I mean, these are global problems that have to be handled globally. We can't isolate ourselves. So do you think that the nation states, I mean, can you imagine them disappearing relatively soon, or do you think we're kind of caught on this idea at this point?
I think it's important to remember how ardently a lot of globalists thought that the nation state was on the wane, right? And especially after the end of the Cold War, that this historical artifact, its era was going to come to an end, and we were entering a new global era. A lot of these people were heads of corporations who were doing global business, and who saw newly accelerated forms of transportation and communication across vast distances, and the dropping of trade restrictions as meaning that the economy was now global, and our political economy was globalizing as well. I think a lot of, if you were to read, say, The Economist magazine in those years, there was a lot of, well, and it's true, there seems to be quite a bit of suffering among people who still believe in the nation. But, as in times past, that will all iron out. Like there's a kind of weird audacity and unconcern about the consequences of what is profiting a very small number of global corporations. So it's easy for me to say that now that we're in the midst of a global populist revolt, that, these people should have seen that coming and shouldn't have engaged in the behaviors they engaged in that left so many people suffering. But it's nevertheless true.
So I don't see other questions. So let me see this. You talked about the United States being a state nation. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, my colleague David Armitage is the person I cite there. If you look at the footnotes, if there are footnotes in that book, who's written a very incisive essay arguing that most nation states begin as nations, that is, a body of people often joined by common lines of descent and a shared history, and then become states. That is, they have a sovereign government that rules them, as opposed to empires or other forms of governance. A sovereign people who, as citizens, constitute the nation state. But the United States kind of happened in the reverse, as I spell out in the book. I know you'd wanted to ask a question about narrative, so we're kind of at the end. Sheila, if you want to.
Well, I just want to, you kind of answered it, to talk about the importance. You described yourself as a narrative historian, and you talked about the importance of narrative to conveying history. You kind of talked about it, but is that controversial that's a commitment of yours among other historians?
I don't know.
Oh. I'll ask you an easier one. So I read an interview that you said that with all these essays you write for the New Yorker, that you have to include something in an essay that you found in an archive that nobody has found before. And I thought that was fantastic. And I wanted to ask you, what's the top 2 or top 3 things that little nuggets that you uncovered, if you can think of them at this late hour?
Yeah, I, it really is just such a willful pride on my part. I once wrote what started as a review of a book about Roger Ailes, a journalist's biographical attempt to reckon with Ailes's life. And I engaged in this extended weaving together of the lives of William Randolph Hearst and Roger Ailes. And the piece ends with Citizen Kane and a lawsuit that was filed against, I think it's RCA, who was the ultimate producer of the film, and Orson Welles, who obviously, wrote the story and played Kane, for plagiarizing a biography of the actual Hearst. And I found through a weird series of searches a deposition that Orson Welles had given while in Casablanca filming some other film. The deposition was for the lawsuit, in which he explained that he really knew very little about William Randolph Hearst and had certainly never read that book, but that every American understood that there was such a person as an American sultan, a man who thinks all other people are there to serve his interests, and to be sold stuff that he wants to sell so that he can have the life of a sultan. And I mean, the quote is, I've completely not done it justice. The quote is a killer. It's just an incredibly powerful statement of what is grotesque about Hearst and what was grotesque about Ailes. And it was just like, I think, pretty much every reader, but like the two Orson Welles biographers who might have come across, would think that was just a thing that everybody knew about Orson Welles, and some canard that Orson Welles had said. But like, it was dug out of a library and scanned and sent to me, and the archivist was like, "Oh my God, this thing is crazy! Like, how did you know this was going to be in this box?" And I was like, "Well, I did a lot of, So, so it's the kind of thing like nobody knew. It's like it's like an Easter egg in a computer code.
See,
Nobody
that's the
knew.
fun of being a historian.
Nobody knew but me. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
right. That's excellent. Well, this is a great place to stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of Spencertown Academy Art Center, this has been fascinating, enlightening, frustrating in many ways. We can't get the answers we want all the time. Thank you so much. It's been just wonderful of you to spend the time with us. And I want to thank the audience too for joining us and for putting up those wonderful questions that Jill was so gracious in answering. Thank you, and good night all. Be well, be safe. Bye-bye.